For those of you who want to follow along on social media, you can follow me at Colin E. Seal or at Think Law US. And I am going to do a deep dive and just go right into this. At Think Law, what we do is we help educators teach critical thinking using real life legal cases in upper grades, fairy tales and nursery rhymes in lower grades, because there's so many funky characters in children's stories. And then we do a lot of work just like this, where we are looking at educators and parents and giving them a lot of practical workshops to apply these strategies throughout what they're doing in their day-to-day work. So as we look at this, I want to start by having this conversation around this moment that we're at, the moment a lot of you have been at for a long time, actually, where we talk about issues around equity and anti-racism, and we've got school systems, charter schools that are putting out these Black Lives Matter statements. And I know that a lot of folks are like deep diving into this. But let me ask you a question. Why is it that despite that deep dive, despite that intent, why do we so often see that equity initiatives are not translating into the actual classroom? Family Feud style, what will be your number one answer to explain what's going on here? Go ahead and drop in a chat. Like, all of y'all have really good ideas based on your experience. What's going on here? Why is it that the most well-intended equity initiatives are not translating into the results that we want to see? We're still seeing disproportionate discipline. We're still seeing academic outcomes that don't match up based off of race and socioeconomic status. Like, what's going on? Where's the gap? What are your thoughts about where the gap is for this? What is happening? Why is it so funky? Sometimes we hear people talk around issues of like implicit bias or not getting the right level of buy-in. Maybe there's an issue of, hey, you know what? Sarah's talking about it. It's the pointer finger problem of, if I look at all the challenges in the world, I can never look at myself. I can tell you this as a Black male educator who became a teacher to be a mentor to younger Black males. I can tell you that I was a part of the problem because I was disproportionately referring Black males to get out of my class because of behaviors that I thought I was kind of like over preparing them for a harsh world, when really I was making a choice to give them tough love instead of love love. Maybe we don't have the funding to execute the equity initiative to its full promise. And when I start looking at this, when I start digging into the why, a big part of it comes down to the idea that, like, maybe that's not the right question at all. Maybe the question is really the how question. How do we get to the how? And I think about my career. I think about, being really excited to be at this conference in particular, because having started my career at Paul Public Charter School in DC, teaching at another independent charter school in Las Vegas, and being a founding teacher at another one, and having a chance to actually be the president of the Charter School Association of Nevada for several years, I always thought it was so interesting that, like, when we start thinking about what equity looks like at the classroom level, we don't always flesh it out. We don't always make it very specific. We're not even clear about what we mean when we say equity. So when I talk around thinking about this personally, when I think around a lot of the themes in my Thinking Like a Lawyer book, it's hard for me to look at this without looking at my two children. So Rose and Oliver, Rose is 7. She skipped over the first grade. She's in the 3rd grade. You probably have a good idea who runs my household. My son Oliver is 5 years old. He just started kindergarten. And I like to say he graduated. He graduated because he spent his pre-K years using the word actually over and over again. And now his favorite word is technically. Do y'all know Oliver? Is there an Oliver in your household? Is there an Oliver in your school? Are you actually Oliver yourself? Either way, it's all good. But when I look at our family, when I look at the reality of me doing this work right now across 35 states, being able to be a math teacher, have my computer science degree, go to law school while teaching math, and ending up practicing this work that I'm doing now, I sometimes look back and I am a little shocked. I'm a little shocked because in many ways, I was the kid we don't reach. I was a kid who was on free and reduced lunch. I was a kid who was raised as part of an immigrant family. This is a picture of me in my grandmother's house when I was younger, where we lived with a one-bedroom apartment with up to 9 people living there at any given time. And what's so interesting about this time, in addition to my father being incarcerated for a decade for selling drugs, in addition to having so many other issues happening in our lives and that struggle in Brooklyn, I also had another challenge. I wouldn't say I was a bad first grader, but I was gifted at being bad. You want to say what I'm saying? Like, I went the extra mile. I put in that effort, that extra energy. Like we had this teacher named Miss Lipschitz, and honestly, I don't know how you don't get in trouble with a teacher named Miss Lipschitz. And she once asked me to do this reflection on my behavior. So I decided to write the words, I hate science, exactly 32 times. Because that way I had 4 words left to write, I hate you, too. Now, here's what's crazy about that. I ended up having to get tested for a speech impediment, my behavior issues, whatever else was going on. But it turned out I was supposed to be in gifted classes since I was in kindergarten. So now I'm being bused to this school where the same exact behavior I used to get in trouble for was now required. Now, when I'm asking all these questions all the time, I wasn't being willfully defiant. I was being inquisitive. So, in addition to my 90s sweater game being on point, in addition to my mother putting me in possibly the highest high waters in human history, there was something else funky about this moment. And the funky part about this moment is that there were 30 plus kids in every elementary school in PS208. My class only had 24. But if you look closely, this was actually 12 kids per grade level. That's 4th/5th grade. They only identified 12 kids per grade level to give access to this transformational experience. So this is when it first hit me that although brilliance is distributed equally, opportunity is not. And when I'm talking about opportunity today, what I'm trying to get into this idea around critical thinking access. Because if we think about critical thinking access and we know it's so important, why do we still treat it like a luxury good? And I realize that if we can give our kids equitable access to the kind of education that allows them to lead, innovate, and break the things that need to be broken, now we're on a whole nother layer. Now we're making equity real because we're giving a transformational educational experience to all kids. But let's start by understanding what critical thinking even is to begin with. So a lot of you are here, I imagine, because you're adamant about critical thinking. You find that this is an important aspect of education. Well, why? What is it? Before we actually talk about how to get it to happen in our classrooms, how would y'all define critical thinking? What pops out? What's critical thinking? And let's give me just a 1 word or 2 words, like critical thinking is blank. Drop it in the chat. What comes to mind when you think critical thinking? So a lot of times people are starting to fill in this blank around critical thinking is the ability to blank, the ability to blank, being able to blank, right? So when we start going through the construct of critical thinking, we look at the ability to reason, the ability to analyze, even to think about your own thinking, which we call metacognition. But if we dig deeper, we realize critical thinking isn't just a set of skills. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story. There's this kid, Ramel, sharpest young man I'd ever come across. Brilliant problem solver, super creative thinker, but Ramel's not a kid in my class. Ramel is my client in my law school's juvenile justice clinic, and he's trying to figure out how to beat adult charges after a serious drug bust just 1 month before his 18th birthday. You see, Ramel, like a lot of kids we serve, had all the critical thinking skills in the world, but you need more than just skills. You need the habits and the mindsets to actually apply these skills. We call these your critical thinking dispositions. How likely is it that you actually apply critical thinking throughout life, academics, and career? And I think you all know intimately what I'm talking about here. Because true or false, you know somebody who is unquestionably brilliant, but finds some way to do the dumbest stuff you ever heard of. Y'all know that person? That person who's unquestionably brilliant, has a way to do the dumbest stuff you ever heard of. If you don't know that person, you might actually be that person. But that difference between knowing better and doing better is often explained by having critical thinking skills, but lacking those dispositions, making us even funkier. Critical thinking tends to be something that is very context dependent, meaning that one day I've got to think like a scientist, the next day I'm thinking like a historian. And if you realize we've got these kids who sit here that are like, oh, I'm going to write until my hands start hurting, but I don't do math. Or I'm going to pour blood, sweat, and tears into a project in fine arts and not even attempt a science project. We can't afford one trick ponies anymore. Our kids need to be flexible, agile. They need to be able to be ready for the type of flexibility that's going to be expected of this workforce that they're entering into. And I used to stop right here. I used to say, you know what? We're all good. Let's move on. But then I recognized that there's more to it. I'm going to give you all a true or false question. True or false? As of November 2020, it's safe to say that we are experiencing a crisis of anti-intellectualism in our country. As of November 2020, true or false, it's safe to say we're experiencing a crisis of anti-intellectualism in our country. Like you've got your facts and your experts, I've got my Facebook group. And if we think about this, think we got to step back and take some responsibility. When I say we, I'm talking about we as educators, we as parents, we as community members, because we've created an interesting space around what intellectualism even means. I'll give you a quick story. My daughter Rose, like I said, sweet girl. And I write about this in my book. One day I'm with Rose and we're doing dishes. And she's at the table and I'm like, hey, Rose, can you pass me the cup that's on the table so I can wash it out? And she's like, Dad, there's no cup on the table. I'm like, Rose, come on. Like, there's a cup right there. Can you please pass me the cup? And she's like, Dad, there's no cup. I see a glass though. Man, I turn off that sink so fast. I go over her all up in the face like, listen to me. You are not about to be one of those kids who knows exactly what I'm talking about. You find some minor technicality and use it against me to make me feel stupid. Because you do that, you're not going to have any friends. And I realize that might be a little dramatic. However, at what point do we start realizing that it's worth it to be explicit? That doing right is more important than being right. Like actually making that clear that I don't need you to make other people feel stupid to be smart. And I always wonder why this is the case. Like we can look at John Lewis and his life and legacy around good trouble, but miss the lesson that doing right is more important than being right. Somehow we can like study Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, but still miss this message that doing right is more important than being right. The engineers of the Holocaust were critical thinkers. We can't just talk about critical thinking for the sake of critical thinking. We're doing it with this idea that there's got to be worthy objectives of which to think critically about. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't necessarily know what doing right actually means, but I do know that if that's where I'm leaning, if I recognize that being right in and of itself is not an end goal, but doing right, actually picking that moral high road, actually starts to make sense and push this conversation a little bit deeper. So let's dig into this because even if you're not someone that's looking at it more from a let's make the world a better place perspective, but you're looking at it from a I need my kids to thrive perspective, which is it can't just be the knowledge that they're getting. And one of the beautiful things about so many independent charter schools that I see here at this conference is a lot of you are subscribing to this model of going beyond academics. Our kids need to know this process of learning how to learn, how to unlearn, how to relearn. I also know that we're still limited. We're still on these constraints where we all want the four C's, right? Like when y'all see the four C's, y'all know what the four C's are. You got communication, you got collaboration, you got creativity, you got critical thinking. In this picture, it looks like you got a fifth C. You got COVID. They way too close. You need to spread out 6 feet minimum. But there's another issue here, which is that how we're measuring, how we're being measured doesn't always line up. But by the end of today's presentation, I hope that I make it clear that this is not an either or proposition. We can actually accomplish both without sacrificing the soul of what it means to be an effective teacher. So when we look at this and start digging in deeper, I want to be clear to you all that I once made a very questionable life decision that paid off in a cool way. When I was teaching full-time and going to law school at night, it was unwise in a lot of ways that are obvious. It was a little ridiculous to do this. However, what I realized was there's something crazy about law school. You're not even learning the law. There's too many laws. Laws change all the time. So you're learning how to think like a lawyer. And this whole thing is like, well, we got 25 past presidents that were attorneys. We got 35 founding fathers. We got Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela. So when we start looking into this, it gets to be this thing of what is really going on? Why is it that like we're waiting until law school to give our kids access to 25 past presidents that were attorneys to give our kids access to the same type of critical thinking skills, habits, and mindsets they need? Especially since when we tap into that sense of justice and fairness, it really starts to unlock those emotions, those critical thinking dispositions. So let's give this a shot. Let's actually take a look at what this is going to look like. Okay, we'll do a real life example real quick. You got this kid, Brian, who's 5 years old. Brian saw his aunt about to sit down in the chair. Just before she sat, he pulled it out. She fell, broke her hip, had all these medical injuries, turned around and sued his own nephew for battery. One more time. Brian is 5 years old. He saw his aunt about to sit. Just before she sat, he pulled it out. She fell, broke her hip, had all these medical injuries, turned around and sued him for battery. And by the way, if you either do the little scan thing on your phone or you go to thinklaw.us/ICSV C20, you'll be able to get a handout for this session, and we'll email you back with some of the sample lessons that we go over today as well. So looking at this, you commit a battery when you make intentional contact that's harmful and causes damages. So in your gut feeling, presuming Brian can pay, in the chat, let me know. Do you think Brian should be liable for battery, presuming he could pay? Yes or no? I don't want to hear no analysis, just yes or no. Should Brian be liable for battery in this case? Yes or no? And what's interesting as you think about this and you give me that gut feeling, right? That gut reaction, that sort of gut sort of thing that comes to mind about Brian's potential liability here is usually 95% of my room is saying, no way, it's ridiculous. I always have a few heartless educators. Heartless educators, where you at? Put your hands up. That are like, man, forget this kid. He's liable, whatever. But what I want you to do is I want you to step outside of your initial analysis. For those of you that sat here on the side of like, Brian shouldn't be liable, I want you to be the aunt's attorney. This lady is coming to you for help because her rascal of a 5-year-old nephew has come and like caused her to be brutally injured. Okay? She's suffering. She's in a lot of pain. She needs your help, people. Nobody cares about this aunt, but whatever. I want you to be her attorney. What's going to be the best evidence that she's going to use to prove that Brian did this intentionally? Now, mind you, we can't make anything up. The evidence is limited. The second thing is we're presuming everything is true. We're at the point of the case where we stipulate to these facts. And I'll tell you the facts one more time. Brian is 5 years old. Brian saw his aunt about to sit down. Just before she sat, he pulled it out. She fell and broke her hip, had all these medical injuries, and turned around and sued her own 5-year-old nephew for battery. What's the best evidence you're going to use as the aunt to support that he did this on purpose? Any ideas in the chat you want to share? Can't make anything up. Let's go through those facts one more time. What do we know about what happened here? We know Brian is 5 years old, but what did he actually do? He did see his aunt about to sit, right? He did actually pull out the chair, right? But there's a detail here that matters. What detail matters about him pulling out the chair? There's something funky. There's something that made it so that she would fall. It was something that would make her falling a basic certainty. What is it about the way he pulled out the chair that led to this becoming a basic certainty that it would lead to this outcome? Do we see it? Do we see it? So it wasn't just that he pulled it out. It's just that he pulled it out in such a way, in such a manner, that it was the exact moment she was going to sit. That took timing, thoughtfulness, calculation to pull it out just at the point where she would no longer be able to stop herself from the forces of gravity. So I might go into court and say, Your Honor, Brian is 5 years old, but this particular 5-year-old not only saw his hand about to sit, not only pulled out the chair, but he pulled it out at the exact moment she was going to sit. Now, I can't look in his head and prove he did it on purpose, but ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what do you think? Now, I know some of y'all have been dying to defend Brian. Dying to defend Brian. So if you were like a 6th grader defending Brian, it's clear. Your essay response would have 3 words in it. He is 5, exclamation point, underline, my work here is done. And why are they saying that? Maybe they're trying to say that 5-year-olds don't understand the consequences of their actions, and I'll give you that. I don't think that most 5-year-olds want to purposely hospitalize their relatives. Most. Some of y'all be tripping, but like most. But I need something better than that. Is there anyone here who could look at the same set of facts, but tell me a different story? Is there a different story to be told here about what's going on with Brian? Anybody see it? What if Brian was in a different boat? What if Brian was actually here trying to help his aunt? This gentleman in training kind of theory. Like, he saw his aunt about to sit, so of course he pulled out the chair. Of course he pulled it out at the exact moment she was going to sit. Why did he pull it out too far? Because he's 5. 5-year-olds might not have the best hand-eye coordination, fine motor skills. So when I start looking at this, I recognize that's a much better argument than saying it was a joke that went bad. Because if it was an accident, by definition, it can't be on purpose. Now, I want to dig in with you on something, because this is where it gets a little funky. The contact part, there was no touching, right? And for a lot of my kids, they look at that and they're like, oh, case closed. But what would the world look like if pulling out a chair on somebody the second they were going to sit wasn't considered a battery? What else wouldn't be considered a battery? Can I throw a brick at your head and say, well, technically, Your Honor, the brick hit him? Probably not. So we start to see that there's this funk, there's all this gray. A lot of you probably heard this case and thought, this is weird. Why is an aunt being sued by our own nephew? So now we start looking at what's really going on. What's the big picture story? What's happening behind the scenes here for real, for real? Because this seems like some nonsense. What's really going on? So when I start thinking about this, I realize maybe there's some alternative theories of this case. Maybe there's a backstory of family drama. Maybe Brian's done this 77 times and he has to be held accountable. Maybe she really needs to money. I don't care about any of those possibilities. Here's what I care about. If this was US history and we were asking kids to explain who the most influential figure is of the progressive era, if we were asking our kids in science to predict what's causing a chemical reaction to occur, what's the most common answer that our kids give you when it's not right in front of their face? Oh, or the infamous, I'm gonna sit here and stare at you. You'll stare right back at me, and at some point you're gonna realize I'm not answering your question, Miss Lipschitz. But when we dig into that sense of justice and fairness, now it's like they go to the edge of the earth for Brian. Now they're seamlessly making these public policy connections. They're jumping off the page. They're making predictions and inferences. What would the world look like if you could just go around pulling out chairs on people who get seriously hurt but couldn't recover because of their age? On the other hand, what would the world look like if you could just sue 5-year-olds every time a practical joke goes wrong? Neither world is ideal, but which would you prefer to live in? And at that point, we've taken something that's so conceptually simple. You could introduce it in elementary school. And we brought it up all the way to a level of rigor that's discussed in courtrooms around the country. Now, here's the funk. Has anybody changed their mind? Has anybody who came into this saying there's no way Brian would be liable changed their mind? Because it happens. It doesn't mean that you're a flake. Evidence can sometimes change your mind. Let's say it didn't change your mind, and you still think Brian shouldn't be liable. Do any of you think, even though you don't think Brian should be liable, a judge would? Does that make you irrational? No. No. What it does is it ties into something a little bit bigger. In this actual case, Brian was found liable. Okay? So I can look at this reasoning and go through it, but who cares? If you don't like this opinion, guess what? It is literally an opinion. It's not a right answer. A judge once had the opinion that separate but equal was okay. We didn't have to accept that either. So listen to me. When we give our kids the power in our instruction to not just show them how to analyze the world the way it is, but question the world as they believe it ought to be. You've all heard that phrase, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But this is the process. Going into justice and fairness as our angle, this is the process for making that horse ridiculously thirsty for the kind of critical thinking that we know is a pathway for justice and education. If we can find a way throughout our models to create a space where kids are making a claim, backing up that claim with evidence, looking at different perspectives. On one hand, Brian might argue. On the other hand, his aunt will argue. Weigh consequences. What would the world look like if? And then have a conclusion that comes from this. This is power. When we give a third grader a chance to analyze this through our draw plus C framework, where we have a decision, a rule, arguments on both sides, and then that world question, what would the world look like if? And by rule, the rule could be a legal case like it is in this example. It could be a mathematical principle. It could be a construct around what actually makes a country song a country song. Because maybe I'm analyzing whether Old Town Road should be eligible for a country music award. And I want to point your attention to this third grader's response on that world column. If the aunt wins her case, other kids will start getting sued. Kids don't have money or lawyers. So our kids are thinking about the bigger consequences of what's going on by stepping outside. So I want to dig into this because if a third grader wrote a paragraph like this, I might throw a parade. To be honest with you, if a 10th grader wrote a paragraph like this, I'll still be pretty impressed. How do we create these structures around critical thinking so it doesn't feel like one more thing? Part of it comes from rethinking what we think around engagement. I'll tell you something. I think engagement is highly overrated because engagement does not necessarily equate to learning. If we really want to think about this, there's certain types of engagement that we should focus on. There's a lot of charter schools, especially a lot of the bigger networks across the country, that spend a lot of time talking about this construct of grit. And I say, I don't know that we should spend this much time talking about grit because a lot of our kids exercise grit so often in their daily lives, right? Whether it be just persisting through the struggle or it be the grit applied to things that they're super interested in, right? Like you never have to ask a kid to be gritty about playing Fortnite until 3 o'clock in the morning. But there's something about a space and learning where nobody's asking, is this going to be on a test? Are we getting a grade for this? There's this intrinsic motivation. There's a part of like, not just a relationship, but a learning relationship. The idea that if we did this thing in a group just now, y'all will be building on each other. There'll be a lot of, yes, and, oh, I haven't thought about that. Oh, yeah, you're right, you're right, you're right. That's the kind of learning relationship that gets prioritized through that motivation and agency-based engagement strand. The other part that I want to focus on is active citizenship. When our kids are getting the tools to lead, innovate, and break the things that must be broken, and we get them to question the way the world ought to be, it creates that massive engagement challenge, particularly for secondary learners who start to feel this massive disconnect between what they're learning in school and what their lives are actually feeling like and what they require to actually navigate life. And here's where I get into a funk. I get into a funk all the time around the country. We do this all over. And people are like, Colin, I rock with you on this critical thinking stuff. I love critical thinking. I'm critical thinking's biggest champion. And I say this and I say, you know what? Cool. But then they come to me with a lot of skepticism. They say, Colin, I'm not too sure about this because at the end of the day, my kids, they can't think critically. They don't think critically. And if I did all this stuff to try to get them, it won't happen. At the same time, though, and I want to grapple with this. I want to grapple with this. Why is it? Why is it that when I start looking at this in more detail, a lot of our super high flying students struggle with learning in this model? A lot of our kids who are traditional high achievers struggle in this model. Meanwhile, a lot of my struggling learners, kids who despite their best effort typically have a tough time academically, do surprisingly well. And then a lot of my behavior kids who are always getting in trouble for this, that, the other thing become rock stars. What's going on? Well, a lot of my straight A high flying kids, why would they struggle with critical thinking? Why would they struggle with gray? Because they're so used to black and white. They're so used to give me the algorithm, give me the steps, show me the definition, show me what to regurgitate, and I got you. Meanwhile, our struggling learners become experts in learning how to learn. And then for my behavior kids, I mean, listen to me. Like, I was never student of the month, student of the week, even student of the day, but I graduated top of my law school class. And a big part of that was the idea that I spent most of my life as a kid saying teachers what had happened was, and a lifetime of saying what had happened was actually allowed me to see different angles, different perspectives, and get into the nuances of my analysis that a lot of my straight A high flying law school colleagues simply had no experience with. So when we look at this, I want to dive into instruction because it's not supposed to be a pie in the sky workshop. When I start looking at what equity looks like when it comes to critical thinking, equity means we don't settle for giving kids a poetry test where they got to identify the type of poem it is. We can go deeper. We can create a Socratic style seminar around this poem in the kindergarten class to analyze whether this is a happy poem or a sad poem. So the poem is actually called Poem. I loved my friend. He went away from me. There's nothing more to say. The poem ends soft as it began. I loved my friend. So we look at this and we've got kids pulling out evidence of happy. It says love and friend. It says it twice. Soft. Soft is like a good thing. Like teddy bears are soft and mom's pillow was soft. One little boy said, there's nothing more to say is happy. Like, I love my mom. Am I supposed to like give you a speech? I love her. That's it. On the other hand, loved is in the past tense. He went away from me is pretty sad. There's an argument that there's nothing more to say can also be sad. The poem ending has this idea of sadness wrapped around it. In fact, the title itself, how sad do you have to be to call a poem poem? What's wrong with you? Get your life together. Get a counselor or something, right? So we start seeing this and we see, even when we start to scale this up and we look at secondary grades, we start to look at the idea that historians believe Langston Hughes might have been a closeted gay man during the Harlem Renaissance era. Is this poem about a friend or about a friend? Actually, one of his most famous poems, Mother to Son, was famously written from his mom's perspective. Is this even from his perspective? Can I analyze the literary techniques used in each and make an argument either way? Any way I can get my kids to get to this point where they're making this constructed sort of process, then I'm winning because I'm giving them more access to critical thinking. As I dig deeper, I want to think around mistakes because a lot of the reason that a lot of my high flying traditional achievers struggle is they're paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes. Would y'all agree with that? Y'all see this happening a lot in your classrooms, in your schools? Well, as a lawyer, what's interesting is mistakes was our currency. I was a litigator, so all day, every day, I dealt with issues of mistakes. So suppose in a math class, I didn't just say solve this equation. I didn't just say, oh, Mr. Seal did it wrong. What do you think was the mistake that was made? So when I start looking into this, I recognize I can get my kids to analyze and have an attitude towards mistakes very differently. So, for instance, if I had two equations that were both wrong, and I asked my kids which one is more right, do you see the funk? Do you see how this transitions from the what and the how to into the why and the what if? If I have to be an attorney for the left hand side and I'm arguing why the left hand side should get more credit, it might sound like this. Well, as you can see here, I made a small error in subtraction in the first step, but I divided correctly. X equals 5 is very close to the final answer of x equals 6. And in fact, if you want to be technical about it, I actually kind of estimated here. So I made that 8 into a 10, just rounding up so I can get a ballpark. So technically, this is 100% correct. But now look at this other side. This right-hand side, I subtracted correctly, but it looks like I divided incorrectly here, or subtracted here when I'm supposed to divide. But at least I got the first step right. But then actually, I'm going to be a behavior kid. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that this right-hand side is totally right because those first two lines are right. I subtracted 8 from both sides. And also, just so you know, x equals 10 in Roman numerals. Just FYI. But here's the thing. This is the kind of funk that our kids gravitate towards. I literally had two kids in middle school get into a fight over a problem like this. And I gotta say that the idea of my kids being in the dean's office explaining that they're fighting because they were talking mess about each other's equations, I can't lie, I'm proud. I am proud that we were able to get algebra to the point where it actually caused kids to want to scrap. I want that level of buy-in when it comes to anything that I'm teaching. And like I said earlier, this is not pie in the sky. We can do this when we start thinking around test prep. When we start looking at not just why these answers are the right one, but why are the wrong ones there? Can I think like Joe Schmo? Like, let me make sure you understand what I mean when I say Joe Schmo. This shirt right here, which is conveniently available on the Think Law website if you go to Think Law Swag. This shirt, let's say it costs $20 and it's on sale for 10% off. What's the final price? Don't tell me the final price. Tell me, if you were talking to Joe Schmo, and Joe Schmo is the kid who goes too fast, Joe Schmo is the kid who doesn't check his work, Joe Schmo is the kid who always falls for the trick answer, what would be the number one Joe Schmo response for a shirt that costs $20 and is on sale for 10% off? Y'all already know how Joe Schmo is going to do that. You already know Joe Schmo is going to see a 20, see a 10, subtract it, and call it 10. You might actually also see that Joe Schmo might call it a 2. Right? Take 20%, 10% of 20, get a 2, and leave it at that, not even subtract it. Joe Schmo might even pick 1990. But if my kids can start thinking like a test maker, now we're not just in the business of playing the game. Now we're slaying the game. Now we have our kids understanding that like every wrong answer is here for a reason. So when I start thinking around this idea, I can come up with my own multiple choice questions myself. I can anticipate and predict the kind of mistakes that kids are going to make. So now mistakes are not something that are going to paralyze me. Now mistakes become something that becomes part and parcel of what it means to have a deeper learning experience. So this idea of who should win, right? Who's the shadiest fairy tale character? Who's the most influential African American inventor? When we start looking through all the different constructs for this, we realize there's so much funk we're leaving on the table that we can start to incorporate on a day-to-day basis that allows us to analyze issues from different perspectives. Okay? The next thing I want to talk about is something I really, really would like us to talk about more in education, which is giving our kids a little bit more time to make more inferences and predictions through the construct of investigation and discovery. Caveat, direct instruction matters, right? Like my kids need to understand core content really well to get where they need to go. At the same time, the same way that as teachers we want to ask good questions, we want to make sure that our kids themselves are able to ask good questions in their own head. Because if they can do that, then I can feel much more confident that they can guide themselves through rigorous analysis. So an example of this is looking at that famous McDonald's hot coffee case. Some of you might know this case really well. It's in the early 90s. Basic story is lady pulls over. She's in the passenger seat, goes to put on her coffee, creamer and sugar in her coffee, spills it all over herself, gets really, really bad burns. We can spend a lot of time analyzing the question about whether or not she should win. But when we start looking at whether she should win, there's a whole funk around this, okay? I start thinking about what happens in the next 30 minutes. And when I think about what happens in the next 30 minutes, I figure out this sort of like pattern of events. So she's sitting there, she's screaming, she's standing outside, people are looking at her, maybe they're trying to get help. At some point, someone calls an ambulance, maybe they drive to the hospital, she gets seen, etc., etc. But when I'm getting really creative with this is when I say witness, I don't really just want eyewitnesses. I want great witnesses. I want witnesses that might not even be there at the scene, but can help me defend myself if I'm McDonald's, or prove that McDonald's was super reckless if I'm Stella. When I start thinking beyond the page, I realize, yeah, okay, I've got the manager, I've got the person that served the coffee, I got the eyewitnesses, but I've also got the person who made the coffee machine, like the manufacturer of the coffee maker. I might want to look at the manufacturer of the lids in the cup. I might want to look at the manufacturer of the actual car to know if the chair had some issues and maybe it was a shaky chair that caused it. I want to talk to Stella's primary care physician. Was Stella competing in triathlons? Or did she have like Parkinson's or arthritis or something that would cause her to lose her grip on the cup? I might even want to talk to Starbucks and Wendy's and Burger King to see what they do with their coffee. Then I start thinking around physical evidence I can collect. And what I call this is a low floor, high ceiling construct, right? There's not a child in your classroom who can't engage with this to some extent. And by engaging with this, it's giving them more angles around critical thinking than they would normally have. But for my kids who are academically out of this world, who are creatively out of this world, can we be honest about something? The charter sector as a whole, right, there's definitely exceptions, but as a whole, have not been historically known for doing a lot to unleash the magic in our brilliant children, our kids who are super duper achievers, right? A lot of times, especially at the high school level, I see a lot of students leaving our charter high schools for more like academically competitive schools within the district. Again, I know some of you all here, by looking at your profiles, that doesn't fit your particular school model, but there's too many charter schools in our country that don't push enough on this sort of high ceiling construct. We can have a high ceiling, but still have a low floor, right? So this is a practical way to get there. And think about this. Think about what happens now, where I start to create this thing where I have these much deeper sort of witness ideas, and I'm going to start to reveal the information. What if I just stopped right here and did it? There's a funk. You want to dig deeper. There's like a yearning for learning that has been created here. So when I press pause, whether I'm pressing pause but when I'm reading The Gingerbread Man and the gingerbread man gets to the river and he can't get across, and I'm asking you to predict what's going to happen to the gingerbread man. Whether I have taught you some basic properties around rocks, but now you got to classify sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic rocks on your own. But look, I got a bunch of rocks. And then we're slowly starting to give you more information about how to classify and sort those rocks. There's more of an eagerness to understand the depth of what's going on. So when I tell you that the coffee was so hot that she got third-degree burns, 20 degrees hotter than other restaurants, 30 degrees hotter than coffee you make at home, we start digging deeper, finding out that Stella wasn't by herself. There were 700 other people who got third-degree burns. Mind you, third-degree burns are so bad you typically can see bone, right? They're the most painful, severe kind of burn. And in her case, these were serious. 16% of her body was burned, including her most private areas. We start looking at the idea she had to get skin grafts, 8 days of being in the hospital, and she was already a small lady. Permanent, life-changing injury. Do we have more questions? Of course we do. Why was it so hot? Those 700 complaints, how do they break down? Are they like just at that one McDonald's? Are they international? Were they evenly spread throughout the last 10 years? Or was there like a policy shift that led to that? From McDonald's, maybe I'm thinking, like maybe there's a reason we're serving a coffee that's hot if this is Chicago in February versus Phoenix in July. So we start digging deeper. We start recognizing that there's more funk. There's more funk. And when we start looking at that idea of doing right being more important than being right, for instance, It turned out that 700 was a very small number. So the expert witness said, hey, you know what? That's 0.0000057% of all cups of coffee we serve. It's statistically insignificant. So you're going to tell me that the pain and suffering of 700 people is a rounding error? That made the jury pretty mortified. So we start looking deeper. We start looking at something else. And for this one, just a quick sidebar. Y'all know who this is? It's not me. It's actually a guy that went to my high school, Bronx High School of Science. So Neil deGrasse Tyson. Good dude. Really, really love this guy because he's able to like make very complex things very simple, right? Like being able to be smart without necessarily having to be a smart aleck. But then one day, which was 24 hours after the shooting in El Paso, or 48 hours after the shooting in El Paso, which was 24 hours after the shooting in Dayton, Ohio, he sends out this tweet. We horrifically lost 34 people to mass shootings in the last 48 hours. But also, actually, technically, we also use, across any 48 hours, 500 to medical errors, 200 to car accidents, 40 to homicide via handgun. And he comments, often my emotions respond more to spectacle than to data. So he gets dragged for this. And this is one of those moments where I'm like, was he more concerned with being right or doing right? Clearly he was being right. And I'm not even sure he's right. I'm not sure that you can compare somebody driving to El Paso from North Texas with the sole purpose of massacring people because of their nationality while they're going back to school shopping to the randomness of dying via medical error. But that's what we miss when we don't think around critical thinking, around the purpose of the critical thinking. For instance, McDonald's had critical thinkers on their team who realized you can brew the coffee at a safely high temperature and get the same strength out of a fewer number of beans. In fact, Stella was not even a gold digger. She just wanted to see her expenses covered for her hospitalization. McDonald's said, here's $800, have a good life. So when doing right is more important than being right becomes our construct, it opens up doors to understand that like being right is not the be all end all. There's a bigger picture here. When we can use this construct to get our kids to investigate deeper questions so that in science class, they're not doing a recipe kind of experiment, but they're actually experimenting by using this thinking like a lawyer framework, thinking about it as if they were detectives. We have books with open endings. We could do the same sort of construct. Even when I think around like looking at like what is a prime number and a composite number, maybe I can get to a much more internalized understanding if I'm predicting what the definition is based off of the patterns that I give you and the labels that I give you. So it sticks more. Every historical event could be broken down into this sort of investigation as well. And I want to end with this. Just because you can't necessarily figure out exactly how to turn it into an investigation doesn't mean you can't create that level of intrigue as a way to connect with our kids. As a math teacher, I love using poetry. Poetry has a lot of abstractions in it. A lot of poems are very motivational. So I loved using poetry. One poem that happens to be my favorite poem is Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. At this point, I was teaching at Andre Agassi's school in Vegas, which is now Democracy Prep at the Agassi campus. But at that point, you know, until today, it was like 99% African American. And I don't know that Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening is about a white dude in the forest, but I kind of presume it's about a white dude. So I've got this white dude going through a forest full of snow, and I got this school in the middle of the desert with nothing but African American students. And I'm thinking, maybe we've got a problem. Maybe they won't connect. So what I decided to do was Pulp fictionize the content. So Pulp fictionizes you telling the story out of order. So I started with the end. I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And I gave them the title, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Where is this person at, and have you been there before? All of a sudden, kids are starting to relate. Kids are starting to feel like this is the moment you're about to quit. This is the moment you're about to experience a struggle. And when they start to connect and tell these stories about like, you know, being on basketball tryouts, having their ankle turned, but they really, really wanted to make the team so they couldn't quit, being very credit deficient and not knowing that they're going to be able to graduate, but they're the first person in their family who would. So they've got promises to keep and they still got a long way to go, even though they're so close to the end. Now, all of a sudden, when we start going through the poem, these lines stick a lot heavier. Right? The darkest evening of the year, one girl was able to relate that to this idea of being in pre-calculus, being college bound, and having her dad get deported just a month ago. And feeling like this would be a point where like anybody would look at me and say, it's okay to give up. but I've got promises to keep in mind school before I sleep. And even that idea of the woods are lovely, dark, and deep, it's so tempting. It's so comfortable. Nobody would even blame me, except for the fact that you've got promises to keep. And the reason I want to end with this is when we talk equity, a lot of times we start throwing around diverse literature, culturally responsive pedagogy. And can I be clear with you? Culturally responsive pedagogy is about a lot more than throwing the name Jose in a math problem. It's about telling the kids in our class that their views matter, their values matter, their experiences matter. In fact, they accelerate the learning outcome. You have a voice, and your voice matters as a part of what we're building here. So this is the whole point here. When our kids are able to see themselves in the material, whether it's the Canterbury Tales, whether it's Robert Frost, whether it's Langston Hughes, doesn't matter. What matters is that we're prioritizing their presence and making sure that they know that they're not invisible. So when we look at these different constructs, between that draw plus C idea, the idea of looking at different perspectives, even the idea of wait time, making sure that we wait in our classroom so that kids are able to actually like process and think, because they don't think if we don't give them time to think. What do you look at and see yourself saying, you know what, I'm going to apply this thing right here immediately? What stands out as something that you feel like you can start applying immediately after this session? Go ahead and pop it in the chat. And as you're going through that, I want to just clarify that like a lot of what we talk about, we dig in a lot deeper into Thinking Like a Lawyer book. We even have a book study that goes with it. So if you go to the Think Law website and request a quote, you can get that and dig deeper with your instructional coaches, use it for PLCs. Our curriculum is something that you could also use as a practical how for doing this, including some distance learning stuff that we have. We do a ton of virtual PD just like this as well, so you can reach out about that. And we even do much more robust intentional work around grouping this around a collective equity solution that involves parents, that involves teacher PD, and the curriculum itself, including how this looks in a distance learning framework. So keep in touch. Please do follow me at Colin E. Seal at Think Law US. Please feel free to ask any questions you have in the time that we have left. And you can go to this website, ISVC20, thinklaw.us, to be able to give me your information, to keep in touch, get a handout, whatever have you. Anyone that wants to get more Think Law swag, you can get that from our website as well. And I want to invite all of you a chance to come through on Thursday. I'm having a really awesome session with Nancy Gutierrez from the Leadership Academy. And it's Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern, Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Free. Check it out. You can register for our website for that as well. So thank you all so much. And I'd love to take any questions you all have at this time. And Sarah, your point about like approaching learning as something to uncover, like our kids can do so much more than we think that they can when it comes to this stuff. So investigations is just a practical way to set it up so that they can get there. So I appreciate that. Appreciate that. Any other questions or thoughts or things that you see yourself applying immediately after this? So for those of you who stayed around and kind of fought through the technical difficulties to be here, I do appreciate it. I do encourage you all to dig deeper. We have so many resources on our website between our blog and other things that we do. Any questions you weren't able to get asked during today's workshop, email me at colin@thinklaw.us and we can sort it out that way. Do keep in touch and let me know if there's anything that we can help. Thank you so much for being part of the critical thinking revolution, and I appreciate you all.